the other sort of key things that we wanted to look at in terms of minimising negative effects is the 7-year transition period, as I said, maximising recovery through water efficiency infrastructure. This actually brings benefits back into communities, and with the balance from strategic water purchase. Looking at the opportunities for environmental works and measure, and looking at the opportunities for improved efficiency of river operations for multiple objectives. As I said, our system's been developed over many decades to deliver irrigation water efficiency. Sometimes that actually gets in the way of how you can then deliver environmental water in that same system. And we think there's some significant potentials to improve the operations of rivers. Now, I know this is actually probably more Mary's point than mine, but I just want to make it clear that we're not at... there's no intention in the Commonwealth Government's clear policy and in the Water Act and in the Basin Plan legislative instrument, there is no cuts to entitlements or impacts on the reliability of entitlements from the policy. It's always worth having a quick look at where water recovery is. This shows that up until 2009, which is our baseline, there was already a fair amount of recovery, 823. Up until the time we released the Basin Plan, that was about sort of towards the end of November, there'd already been nearly 1,400 gigalitres recovered. Since that time, there's been more recovery with the estimated recovery from the Northern Victorian Renewal Project. And there's probably an estimate of about 300 gigalitres, which Mary might be able to say more about, of recovery through infrastructure. That leaves roughly 1,000 gigalitres a year to be recovered through other measures, including strategic purchases over the next 7 years. This graph I thought was also very interesting, and it just shows you that overall, at the end of this period, in 2019, a total of over, I think it's 3,600 gigalitres of water will be recovered for the environment as held entitlements. So, getting on to the adaptive plan, and I might just pause here for a second and say that in terms of the consultations that we've been having over the last 4 months, I think now, nearly 4 months, there's been a lot of the discussion, particularly the discussions we've had with local leadership groups, local governments and industry leaders, and individual catchment management authorities, the whole range of community leaders who have been heavily involved in this exercise with us. And so I think we've had about 84 or more, nearly 100 of these meetings in various places over the last period. Most of the focus of attention is about how is this going to be implemented? How's it going to work for us? How does localism get involved? How some of our opportunities going to be realised? How can we work to make sure we don't have impacts on our communities or make this of benefit to our communities? So this has been, I think, a real focus for conversation, and I think, Lee, when you said where are things up to, by and large, this is where most of our conversations have been. Now we do have extremes on both ends, and a lot of this hasn't changed since, well, probably for many years, but certainly hasn't changed since the initial discussions on this some years ago, and also in the beginning of the process. So there's still there's some concerns that it's enough already. We don't need any more recovery. And then there's, on the other side of it, there's a very strong push in some quarters to go for far higher levels of recovery than we're proposing. And my estimation is that's going to continue for quite some time. But there is quite a large, I would say, group of people who have got some concerns with a lot of issues and do want changes. And I'm not saying that people don't want changes. There's plenty of issues that people have raised, some really excellent issues that we need to work with. But it's more about how they get those changes, how that's going to work, has been the tenor of the discussion. As I said, localism is one of the key issues, and how do we get involved in that? How do people get involved in water recovery, and how they get involved in the use of the environmental water? Some of this comes from concerns about how we're going to avoid flooding of private property, or how we're going to avoid flooding of favourite community places. And a lot of it is about how we can have a role and a say in the use of the environmental water in our area. So these are some of the key discussions we've been having with people about the opportunities there, as well as working with the state governments on how their sort of state regional planning frameworks and regional engagement frameworks can work with us in that process. So what's next? Well, the draft is out, and we're encouraging people please to put in submissions. I'd echo that here. As much as I sort of feel the more submissions that are going to come in, it's going to be more sleepless nights for the authority, but it's all extremely valuable input that we've been getting so far. As Lee said, we've got 500 so far, but we'd expect most of the submissions to come in at the end of the period, and we're still working very closely with people who are seeking assistance and advice on their submissions and the issues, so that they understand them and can work through it on the submissions. So that will formally finish in 16th of April. Then we have a period where we'll be looking at all of the submissions that come forward, as well as the many issues that have been raised. And I'd have to say we're already looking at the issues that have come up in consultations. And we'll be providing, under the Act, we actually have to provide a report on the submissions that came in, the issues that were raised, and how we've addressed them, and if we haven't changed anything, why not? And that report is a public report, and it also goes to the Ministerial Council, along with the regulatory impact, draft regulatory impact statement, and the final revised basin plan. The Ministerial Council has 6 weeks to look at that and decide whether or not it wants us to look at any new issues or do any more consultation. And that's what we'll undertake. So that's a bit speculative then, how long that's going to take. And then we have the next process is for the Minister to adopt a final plan at the end of that and table that in Parliament. It's a disallowable instrument, so there is the potential for a motion to be raised in Parliament, but that process we expect to be probably towards round about September is probably the earliest that would happen. So that's sort of roughly next in the process sense. In terms of where things are at the moment, as I said, I think there are still a lot of issues to work through, issues of detail and concerns that people have, how we best address these. And so it's still an intense period of working with local groups and communities. And we know there's quite a number, and I would hope, in fact, there's quite a number of people who've already been thinking about some of the things they might want put forward in their submission, and a lot of those are focusing on the future. Many of them, I'm sure, will be also focusing on how to change some of the starting numbers, because clearly the main issue in the public debate has been about the numbers, but I think my assessment is really that that's turning more from how do you get a start and how do you have a proper adaptive management process that involves everyone in the process going forward. So I'm happy to take questions either now, Lee, or do we at the end? At the end. Okay, thanks very much.